Last Thanksgiving, my mother-in-law put my 9-year-old son outside in 26-degree weather and called it discipline. A week later, she showed up at his school without telling us. A month later, she was hinting at legal action. I'm Elara Whitmore, a logistics executive from Brookfield, Wisconsin, and that was the moment I realized this wasn't about family anymore. It was about control. And I decided she would never control my son again. Chapter 1. Adults Only. The first time I heard my mother-in-law say adults only to my son, I told myself it was harmless. We live in Brookfield, Wisconsin, in a quiet subdivision where the lawns are trimmed, the mailboxes match, and nothing dramatic is supposed to happen. Caleb and I bought our house in 2016, the year Nolan started kindergarten. Back then, everything felt earned and steady. Caleb had just taken a senior engineer position with a civil construction firm in Milwaukee. I had moved into operations leadership at a regional logistics company headquartered in Waukesha, a job that eventually turned into the COO title I hold now. We were busy, tired, ambitious, and proud of the life we were building. Nolan is 9 now, 4th grade at St. Bridget's Academy. He's thoughtful in a way that sometimes makes adults uncomfortable, the kind of child who notices when someone's tone shifts or when a room goes quiet. He reads above grade level and still sleeps with the old blue blanket he has had since he was 3. He is not loud. He never has been. Diane Whitmore likes to say she values tradition. She spent 3 decades managing a local bank branch in Wauwatosa and retired with a reputation for efficiency and control. At church, she organizes holiday drives and knows exactly which family sits in which pew. People listen to her. People defer to her. She wears her influence like a tailored coat. The phrase, adults only, started as a joke. At Nolan's birthday party in March of 2022, when he ran up to her with a drawing of our house, complete with a crooked American flag and a stick figure family, she took it between 2 fingers and smiled without looking at it. "That's sweet," she said, then gestured toward the patio where her friends from church were standing with paper plates and white wine. "Adults only, sweetheart. We're talking." Nolan stood there for a second, holding his drawing. I remember how he glanced at me, not crying, not even frowning, just recalculating. I almost said something. Instead, I told myself she didn't mean it the way it sounded. I told myself he would forget. That year, the small things stacked. In June, I came home early from work and found Diane in my kitchen. She had let herself in with the emergency keypad code we gave her after Nolan was born. She had opened cabinets, reorganized spices, and moved the cookie sheets because they made more sense in a vertical rack. She announced she was helping. Caleb laughed it off and said, "Mom likes order." I remember standing there with my purse still on my shoulder, feeling like a guest in my own house. Later, I found out she was listed as an authorized pickup at St. Bridget's. Caleb had signed the form in 2021 when Nolan had the flu and we were both traveling for work. It seemed harmless at the time. Emergency contact, just in case. I did not push back then either. I chose peace over conflict. I did not want to be the overreacting working mom who isolates her husband from his family. Diane liked to talk about boundaries, but only the ones she drew. By November, she had already sent out a detailed Thanksgiving schedule to the family group chat. Dinner at 2, appetizers at 1, football at noon, children downstairs during adult conversation, bring slippers, no outside toys. She ended the message with a turkey emoji, as if that softened the rules. It was 26 degrees the afternoon we drove to her house in Wauwatosa. The sky had that flat, gray Midwest look that makes everything feel colder. Nolan wore a navy sweater over his button-down and carried a small box of brownies we had baked that morning. He asked if he could sit by Grandpa this year. I told him we would see. Diane's living room was already full when we walked in, coats piled on the back of a chair, the television loud with pre-game commentary. The house smelled like turkey and lemon cleaner. Diane greeted Caleb with a kiss on the cheek and Nolan with a quick pat on the shoulder. "Shoes off," she said. "Adults in here." Nolan slipped his sneakers off and stood close to me. I felt him hesitate before stepping forward. When dinner was called, I noticed the place cards. Caleb and I were seated at the long dining table. Nolan's name was written in looping script on a folded card at a smaller table set up near the back door, the door that led to the patio and the wooden steps that faced the yard. He looked at me. It wasn't defiance, it was a question. I leaned toward Diane. "He can sit with us. He's 9. She didn't look up from adjusting the centerpiece. "It's tradition. Kids' table." It wasn't really a kids' table. It was Nolan and 2 toddlers and a stack of coats spilling from the mudroom. Every time someone opened the back door to grab something from the garage fridge, a draft rolled through. I carried Nolan's plate over myself when I realized he'd been served last. He thanked me like he was being given a privilege. After dinner, Diane clapped her hands lightly and announced adult time, basement for the kids. Nolan doesn't like the basement at her house. It is finished but dim, and the older cousins sometimes tease him for reading instead of playing video games. He tugged on my sleeve. "Can I stay up here?" I knelt down. "You can sit quietly next to me." Diane appeared beside us as if summoned. "Adults only. He needs to learn." "He's not interrupting anyone," I said. Diane's smile tightened. "If he can't follow the rules, he can cool off for a minute outside." She walked to the back door and opened it. The cold air hit immediately, sharp and dry. For one suspended second, I expected Caleb to say something. He shifted, uncomfortable, but silent. Nolan looked at me. I saw him calculate again. He stepped toward the door. I thought she would stop him. I thought she was bluffing. Instead, she gestured lightly. "Go ahead." The door closed behind him with a soft click. The conversation in the living room resumed, slightly louder, like everyone needed to prove they hadn't noticed. At first, I told myself it would be 10 seconds, a symbolic minute. Then I noticed the absence of his quiet breathing beside me. I walked toward the back of the house and saw through the small window that Nolan was standing on the wooden steps, shoulders hunched, hands tucked under his arms. The security camera above the patio light blinked red. It records automatically when there's movement. 3 minutes can feel abstract when you're watching it on a clock. It does not feel abstract when your child is outside in 26 degrees. I opened the door. The cold cut through my sweater immediately. Nolan looked up at me. "I didn't want to be loud," he said. That sentence landed harder than the temperature. I wrapped my arms around him and brought him inside. The room fell quiet for real this time. Diane let out a short laugh. "He's fine. It was just a minute." I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I did not explain. I looked at Caleb. "Get your coat." He stared at me for a half beat, then walked toward the hallway. Diane started to say something about overreacting, about ruining dinner, about how children need discipline. I didn't stay to hear it. I zipped Nolan's jacket up right there by the mudroom. His hands were cold, not frostbitten, not blue, just cold enough. We walked to the front door. No one tried to stop us. No one apologized. Outside, the air felt cleaner. Caleb opened the passenger door for Nolan and then looked back at the house. The porch light glowed through the curtains. Inside, I could see silhouettes moving, trying to restart whatever version of the evening they wanted to salvage. I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. The heater roared to life. As we pulled away from the curb, I watched Diane's house shrink in the rearview mirror. I felt something settle inside me. Not anger exactly, but a clarity I had been avoiding for years. 3 minutes in the cold had changed the temperature.
If this story touched you, please subscribe and let someone out there feel less alone. Thank you.
Chapter 2. The Red Light. The house felt different when we walked in that night, like the walls were listening. Nolan went straight upstairs without being told. He did not ask for dessert. He did not complain that we had left before pie. He moved quietly, which somehow felt louder than if he had cried. Caleb stood in the kitchen with his coat still on, hands braced on the counter. I took Nolan's boots off by the door and carried them to the mudroom. My hands were steady, my mind was not. I found Nolan in his room, sitting on the edge of his bed with a blue blanket pulled over his shoulders. He looked up when I walked in. Am I in trouble? The question knocked the air out of me. No, you did nothing wrong. He nodded once, like he was filing that information away for later use. Then he asked if he could sleep with the hallway light on. He had not asked for that in years. I said yes. Caleb and I did not talk much that night. We moved around each other in the kitchen, washing dishes we had not dirtied, putting away leftovers we had brought back untouched. At some point, Caleb said she didn't mean it like that. I didn't answer. Sunday morning, the doorbell rang just after 9. Nolan was at the table eating cereal. The sound made him jump, spoon clattering against the bowl. It's just a delivery, Caleb said automatically. But it wasn't. I checked the doorbell camera on my phone. A package sat on the porch, no person in sight. I watched the replay. The driver rang once and left. Nolan's shoulders had already risen toward his ears. I realized then that the cold had followed him home. After Caleb left for a quick errand, I opened the Notes app on my phone. I keep everything there: contractor numbers, school login passwords, insurance policies, and one line labeled front door code. Under it, a name: Diane. I stared at it for a long time. When Nolan was born in 2013, we gave Diane that code in case of emergency. It felt responsible, sensible, family-oriented. I had never changed it. I had assumed it was understood that access meant trust. I set my phone down and walked to the front door. I crouched and examined the deadbolt like I was seeing it for the first time. It was a standard quick set, nothing fancy. I had replaced one before when we renovated the guest bathroom. I could do this myself. Caleb came back while I was unscrewing the interior plate. What are you doing? Changing the locks. He blinked, then looked toward the stairs, where Nolan's bedroom door was slightly ajar. You think that's necessary? I didn't look up. Yes. There was a pause. Then Caleb stepped closer and held the flashlight from his phone so I could see inside the cylinder. I should have stopped this sooner, he said quietly. That was the first time he said something that did not defend her. We drove to the hardware store in Elm Grove that afternoon and bought a rekey set and 2 new deadbolts. Nolan stayed home with Caleb while I made the run. I did not want him in the aisle hearing me explain why. Back home, I pulled the old cylinder out and replaced the pins so the metal key Diane had would no longer turn. Caleb swapped the entire keypad unit for a newer model that allowed individual user codes. When we powered it back on, it chimed cheerfully. Caleb typed in the old code out of habit. The lock buzzed once and flashed red. Error. We stood there watching the tiny red light blink like it meant something larger than circuitry. Delete all users, I said. He navigated through the menu and erased the entry labeled D. When it was done, he looked at me. Do we tell her? She'll find out. Sunday evening, my phone lit up with Diane's name. I let it ring twice before answering. Why did you leave like that? She said without greeting. You embarrassed me in my own home. Our son was outside, I said. It was a minute. Children need to learn to respect adult spaces. He's 9. You are overreacting, Elara. You always have been sensitive. She paused, then added, I'll come by tomorrow morning and drop off the leftovers. We can talk like adults. Text first, I said. Don't just come over. She made a small dismissive sound and hung up. Monday morning, I was packing Nolan's lunch when the doorbell camera notification popped up on my phone. Motion detected. Diane stood on our porch holding a glass casserole dish wrapped in foil. She wore her navy wool coat and the pearl earrings she saves for church. She looked directly at the keypad and lifted her hand. I watched from the kitchen window as she pressed the old code. The keypad lit up and blinked red. She tried again. Red. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out the metal key. She inserted it into the deadbolt and turned it. It did not move. She stepped back, staring at the door as if it had betrayed her. Nolan was at the table behind me. He had stopped chewing. "Is that Grandma?" "Yes." He slid off his chair and stood a few feet back from the entryway. I opened the door but kept the chain locked. "Good morning, Diane." Her eyes flicked to the chain, then back to my face. The smile she pasted on did not reach her eyes. "Your code isn't working." "We changed it." "Why would you do that?" "Because you let yourself in whenever you wanted." "I was helping." "You put my son outside in 26 degrees. She stiffened. "He was fine." "He was not fine." Her gaze shifted past me, searching for Caleb. "I brought leftovers," she said, lifting the dish slightly. "Can I come in?" "Not today." Her jaw tightened. "I'm your grandmother." "And I'm your mother. Access is conditional." The words came out calm. They did not feel calm. She stood there for a long moment. Then she set the casserole dish down on the porch bench like a statement and walked back to her car without saying goodbye. When I closed the door, Nolan exhaled. "You didn't let her in?" "No." He nodded, then returned to his cereal. That afternoon, just before 3, my phone rang while I was reviewing a shipment schedule for a client in Green Bay. The caller ID read St. Bridget's Academy. My stomach tightened in a way that felt familiar now. "This is Elara Whitmore?" "Hello, Mrs. Whitmore. This is Sister Angela. I'm calling because your mother-in-law is here to pick up Nolan early for lunch." I closed my eyes for a second. No, she is not. "She is listed as authorized pickup in our system." "That form needs to be updated. Please do not release my son." There was a pause. "She has proper identification." "Please keep him inside. I am on my way." I hung up and grabbed my keys without explaining to anyone in the office. I texted Caleb one sentence. "She's at the school." As I pulled out of the parking lot, my hands were steady again, the kind of steady that comes when the decision has already been made. The light at Blue Mound in Calhoun turned red. I waded through it, staring straight ahead. Whatever temperature had changed that night was not going back. I pressed the accelerator the second the light turned green and drove towards St. Bridget's.
If this story touched you, please subscribe and let someone out there feel less alone. Thank you.
Chapter 3. Protocol. The school parking lot was nearly full when I pulled in. Minivans and SUVs lined up in neat suburban lows. St. Bridget's Academy sits on a slight hill, red brick, white trim, a small statue of Mary near the entrance. Nolan has gone there since kindergarten. It has always felt safe, structured, predictable. I walked through the front doors with my coat still half zipped. The receptionist looked up immediately. "Mrs. Whitmore? Is Nolan still here?" "Yes, he's in the office." Relief came in sharp and quick. Sister Angela Ruiz stepped out from the hallway, hands folded calmly in front of her. She is in her early 50s, composed in a way that feels deliberate rather than distant. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said softly, "your mother-in-law is waiting in conference room B." I glanced toward the hallway. "I don't want Nolan to see her." "He won't. He's with Mrs. Klein in the reading room." I nodded once and followed Sister Angela into the small conference room. Diane stood near the window, purse on her arm, posture rigid. "Elara," she said, as if I had kept her waiting for something reasonable. I turned to Sister Angela first. "Please do not release my son to her." Sister Angela's voice stayed even. "Mrs. Whitmore, according to our records, Diane Whitmore is listed as an authorized emergency contact. The form was signed in 2021 by Mr. Whitmore." I looked at Diane. "That was for emergencies." "This is an emergency," she said lightly. "Family matters." I turned back to Sister Angela. "We are updating that form today." Diane exhaled sharply. "You're being dramatic." Sister Angela placed a folder on the table. "For clarity, Once an authorized contact presents valid identification, we are required to release the student unless a court order indicates otherwise. That is our policy. Her tone was neutral, not defensive, not apologetic, institutional. I felt the structure of it settle into place. It was not personal, it was paperwork. I am revoking that authorization, I said, immediately. Diane shifted her weight. You can't just erase family because you're upset. I kept my eyes on Sister Angela. What do you need from me? We require a new pickup authorization form signed by both parents. We can also add a password requirement for phone calls regarding Nolan's release. Good. Add the password. Diane's voice sharpened. This is absurd. I turned to her. Showing up at my son's school without telling us is absurd. She stared at me like I had insulted her publicly. Sister Angela handed me a pen. We will keep Nolan in the reading room until this is resolved. I sat down and filled out the form carefully. I crossed out Diane Whitmore's name with steady lines. I added Thomas Whitmore as a backup contact. I added Maddie Harper. Under special instructions, I wrote that no changes were to be made without confirmation from both parents and the designated password. Diane watched every stroke of the pen. You're going to regret this, she said quietly. I didn't respond. When the paperwork was complete, Sister Angela said she would update the system once Caleb signed. I stepped out into the hallway and called Caleb. She's here, I said, at the school. I know. She called me first. And I'm on my way. He arrived 15 minutes later, face set in a way I hadn't seen before. We signed the updated form together in the front office. Sister Angela made a copy for our records. When we walked Nolan out of the building, he looked between us. Is everything okay? Yes, Caleb said firmly. Everything is handled. Diane stood near her car in the parking lot. She did not approach us. She watched us as we buckled Nolan in the back seat. That night, the emails began. Caleb's phone buzzed at 9:23, then again at 9:30, then 9:38. He sat at the kitchen island, scrolling through them, jaw tight. What is she saying? That you are isolating me, that you're unstable, that this is emotional abuse. I let out a short breath. She always escalates. The third email was longer, paragraph after paragraph about family unity, about respect, about how we were teaching Nolan to distrust his elders. At the end, one line stood alone. We may need legal clarity if this continues. Caleb read it twice. Legal clarity, he repeated. It was vague, no statute cited, no actual threat, just a shadow. The next afternoon, Caleb's phone rang while we were driving Nolan to soccer practice. Pastor Glenn Mercer's name lit up on the screen. Caleb hesitated before answering. Hello, Pastor. I could hear the low hum of the pastor's voice through the speaker. Caleb, I understand there's been some tension in the family. Diane is very hurt. Perhaps we could sit down together and mediate. Caleb glanced at me, then back at the road. I appreciate the concern, Pastor, but this is a parenting decision. There was a pause. Sometimes reconciliation is a powerful testimony. Caleb's hands tightened on the steering wheel. My son being put outside in 26-degree weather is not reconciliation material. He ended the call politely, but firmly. That night, Caleb drove to his parents' house alone. He said he needed to talk to his dad. When he came home, it was close to 11. Nolan was asleep. The house was quiet. Caleb stood in the doorway of our bedroom for a long moment before speaking. Dad said he didn't realize how bad it had gotten. And he said he should have stepped in years ago. I sat up. Years ago? Caleb ran a hand through his hair. He said Mom has always needed control, even when I was a kid. If she set a rule, everyone followed it. If I pushed back, he would tell me not to make it worse. He looked at me then, something shifting. I've been doing that with you, with Nolan. The honesty in that moment was heavier than any argument. You weren't trying to hurt him, I said. I know, but I was trying to keep the peace instead of protecting him. Silence settled between us, but it wasn't the strained kind. It felt more like recalibration. The next morning, Caleb drafted an email. He didn't ask me what to write. He typed slowly, then read it out loud before sending. Do not show up at our son's school again. Do not contact the school directly. Any communication regarding Nolan goes through us. This is not negotiable. He hovered over the send button for a half second. Then he pressed it. We waited. An hour passed. No response. 2 hours. By evening, still nothing. The absence felt louder than the emails had. At dinner, Nolan talked about a science project involving erosion in riverbanks. He laughed when he described how his group accidentally spilled half the water onto the floor. For the first time since Thanksgiving, he sounded like himself. After he went to bed, Caleb checked his phone again. Nothing. You think she's planning something? He asked. I don't know. The lack of reply unsettled me more than anger would have. Diane always filled silence with words. The quiet suggested calculation. I stood at the front window and looked out at the street. The porch light cast a soft glow across the lawn. The new keypad on the door blinked green once, then went dark. Inside, everything was still. For the moment.
If this story touched you, please subscribe and let someone out there feel less alone. Thank you.
Chapter 4. Public Image. By Sunday, the story had already started traveling without us. Caleb came home from an early service at church looking tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. She's been talking, he said, setting his keys down harder than usual. About what? About how she's worried about Nolan, about how you're shutting her out, about how she feels hurt and confused. Hurt and confused sounded softer than what had happened. It sounded reasonable. It sounded like a version people could nod along with over coffee in the fellowship hall. What exactly did she say? I asked. That you overreacted, that you're under a lot of stress at work, that she tried to help and got locked out of her grandson's life. I let that sit between us. Hurt and confused. It was an elegant rewrite. That afternoon, Caleb's phone buzzed again. Pastor Glenn Mercer. Caleb answered on speaker while we were folding laundry in the living room. Caleb, the pastor began, I want you to know Diane is struggling. She feels pushed aside. She's hurt and confused by the sudden change. Caleb glanced at me. There wasn't anything sudden about it, Pastor. She put our son outside in 26-degree weather. There was a pause on the line. I'm not here to take sides, Pastor Glenn said carefully, just to encourage grace. Families fracture easily. Caleb's voice stayed even. Protecting my son isn't a fracture, it's parenting. After he hung up, the room felt heavier. I could see the ripple effect already. Diane had always known how to manage perception. She had spent 30 years in banking and longer than that in church leadership. She understood influence. She understood timing. If she framed herself as the wounded grandmother, people would listen. The following Tuesday, I was in my office at the logistics headquarters in Waukesha reviewing quarterly distribution metrics when my assistant told me Rachel Morgan from HR wanted a quick word. Rachel rarely dropped by without an agenda. She closed the door gently behind her. Do you have a minute? Of course. She sat across from me and folded her hands. I received a call yesterday from someone identifying herself as a concerned family member. She asked about your workload, your stress levels, whether you seemed overwhelmed lately. My jaw tightened, but I kept my expression neutral. And what did you tell her? That we do not discuss personnel matters with outside parties. Rachel held my gaze. She implied she was worried about your stability. The word hung in the air. Stability. It was subtle,
Not an accusation, just a suggestion planted carefully. I nodded once. If it becomes professional, I'll address it professionally. Rachel gave a small nod of her own. It hasn't. I just wanted you to be aware. When she left, I sat very still for a moment. Diane had crossed into my workplace. Not loudly, not recklessly, just enough to test whether the ground would shift under me. It didn't, but she had tried. That Thursday, Caleb came home from school with a piece of folded construction paper tucked into his backpack. He handed it to me at the kitchen counter without saying much. I unfolded it. "Our house is safe" was written in careful block letters across the top. Beneath it, he had drawn our front door with the new keypad. A small green square indicated the light. Inside, 3 stick figures stood close together. I crouched down to his level. "Tell me about this." He shrugged. "It's just our house." "Is it safe?" He nodded. "Because you locked it." The simplicity of it made my throat tighten. That weekend, I scheduled an appointment with Dr. Helen Carter, a child psychologist in Elm Grove, recommended by one of the other moms at St. Bridget's. I did not frame it as therapy. I told Nolan we were going to talk to someone who helps kids understand big feelings. Dr. Carter's office was warm and intentionally cluttered with puzzles and beanbags. Nolan sat on a small couch while she asked him about school, soccer, friends. At one point, she asked, "What makes you feel safe?" He thought for a second. "When I know the rules don't change." After the session, Dr. Carter spoke with me privately. "Children measure safety by consistency, not by perfection. If he sees that you and Caleb are aligned and steady, that will matter more than the incident itself." Aligned and steady. It felt like a directive. The next Sunday, the church hosted a potluck after service. Caleb and I debated not going, but avoiding it would look like confirmation of whatever Diane had implied. So we went. The fellowship hall smelled of coffee and casserole. Long folding tables were covered with foil trays and plastic containers labeled in Sharpie. Diane stood near the center of the room, surrounded by a small circle of women. She saw us immediately. Her smile was bright, too bright. "Elara," she called out, stepping forward. "I'm glad you came." I met her gaze evenly. So am I. There were eyes on us, curious, assessing. Mrs. Linda Crawford, who lives 2 streets over from Diane and had been at Thanksgiving, stood near the dessert table. She watched for a moment, then walked over. Linda is not loud. She is not dramatic. She is, however, direct. "Diane," she said, not unkindly, but clearly, "I've been thinking about that night." Diane's smile tightened. "Which night?" "Thanksgiving. You put a child outside in 26 degrees. The room did not fall silent, but the conversation around us thinned. Diane let out a soft laugh. "It was barely a minute. It's being exaggerated." Linda didn't smile. "I was there. It wasn't exaggerated." Diane's posture stiffened. "This is a family matter." "It stopped being private when it involved a child," Linda replied. I stood there, saying nothing. I didn't need to. For the first time since this began, Diane looked slightly off balance. Later, as we carried our empty dish back to the car, Caleb exhaled slowly. I didn't expect that. Neither did I. Back home, Nolan asked if Grandma was mad. I told him the truth. Adults can be upset and still learn. That night, Caleb checked his email again. There was one new message from Diane. Short, no long paragraphs, no scripture references, no explanations. "This isn't over." He read it out loud. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. Not fear exactly, but recognition. She wasn't done trying to control the narrative. She wasn't done testing boundaries. But something had shifted. The church had heard another version. My company had not flinched. Nolan was sleeping with the hallway light off again. I looked at the front door from the living room couch. The keypad blinked green once in the darkness, then faded. The house was quiet. The next move would not be mine. If this story touched you, please subscribe and let someone out there feel less alone. Thank you.
Chapter 5. Consequence. She made it anyway. 2 days after that email, Caleb's phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't vague or dramatic. It was logistical. "We should sit down with an attorney," Diane had written. "I need to understand my rights." Rights. The word was clinical, strategic. I didn't respond. Instead, I texted Maddie Harper. Maddie and I met our first year at Marquette. She went to law school in Madison and now practices family law in Milwaukee County. She is sharp without being theatrical, the kind of lawyer who reads statutes for sport. We met her at a small coffee shop in Elm Grove on a Saturday morning, neutral ground, public, bright windows and the hum of espresso machines. Maddie set her laptop on the table between us. "Tell me exactly what happened," she said. I walked her through Thanksgiving, the lop change, the school, the email about legal clarity. Maddie listened without interrupting, fingers steepled under her chin. "Okay," she said finally, "let's talk about grandparents' rights in Wisconsin." Caleb leaned forward slightly. "Is that even a thing?" "It can be," she said, "but not the way people imagine. Under Wisconsin law, grandparents can petition for visitation in limited circumstances, usually if there's been a divorce, separation, or if the child has an established caregiving relationship with the grandparent and cutting contact would cause harm." Harm. She tapped her keyboard and turned the screen toward us. "The court looks at whether the grandparent has acted as a consistent caregiver, school pickups, overnights, medical decisions, not occasional visits, and they consider whether denying visitation would be detrimental to the child." "Diane doesn't watch Nolan," I said. "She's never had him overnight." "Exactly," Maddie replied. "She has no established caregiving role, and there's no evidence that limiting contact is harming him. If anything, you have documentation that you're protecting him." Caleb exhaled slowly. "So she can't just force her way in?" "She can file a petition. Anyone can file. But filing and winning are two very different things. And based on what you've told me, she would have a very weak case." I felt something loosen in my chest. Maddie closed her laptop. "That said, if you want to minimize escalation, you can set clear, written boundaries. Courts like parents who appear reasonable and consistent." Reasonable and consistent. It was the same language Dr. Carter had used about safety. We left the coffee shop with a plan. Not to fight, not to retaliate, to define. Diane texted Caleb later that afternoon. "Let's meet, just the three of us." We chose a different coffee shop in Brookfield, one with wide open windows and plenty of witnesses. Sunday at 10. Diane arrived precisely on time. Navy coat again, structured handbag, controlled expression. She sat down without greeting me. "I've spoken to people," she began. "I'm sure you have," Caleb said evenly. "I need to understand why you're shutting me out of my grandson's life." "You showed up at his school without telling us," I said. "Because you overreacted and locked me out of your house." "You put him outside," Caleb replied. Her jaw tightened. "It was a minute." "It was enough," I said. She looked at Caleb. "You're turning my son against me." Caleb didn't hesitate. "No, you did that yourself." The words landed between them like something physical. For a moment, Diane looked almost startled, not wounded, not offended, surprised. "I have always been involved," she said more quietly. "I have always cared." "Caring doesn't mean control," I replied. She folded her hands on the table. "What exactly do you want?" I met her gaze. No unannounced visits, no showing up at Nolan's school, no contacting my workplace. If you want to see him, it's in a public place with notice for a set amount of time. "Like supervised visitation," she said with a sharp edge. "Like boundaries," Caleb answered.
She stared at the tabletop for several seconds. "You've made me look like a monster." "You did that yourself," Caleb repeated. There it was again, not louder, just steady. Her shoulders lowered slightly. "I shouldn't have put him outside." The admission was flat, no tears, no softness, just compliance. I waited, but nothing more followed. "Thank you for saying that," I said. "It can't happen again." She nodded once. "Fine." We sat in silence for several seconds. The barista called out someone's name behind us. A spoon clinked against ceramic. Diane looked older in that moment. Not fragile, just diminished. "I expect respect," she said finally. "Respect goes both ways," I answered. When we stood up to leave, she did not reach for a hug. Outside, the November air had sharpened again. Caleb took my hand as we walked to the car. "How do you feel?" he asked. Clear. Not victorious, not satisfied, just clear. That evening, Nolan was building a Lego bridge across the living room rug when he looked up at us. "Did you talk to Grandma?" "Yes," Caleb said. "Is she still mad?" "Adults can be upset and still make better choices," I said. He studied my face. "Are we allowed inside everywhere now?" The question was simple, not sarcastic, not defiant, just checking the rules. I knelt in front of him. "You are always allowed inside our home." He nodded slowly, as if that answered more than I had said. He went back to his bridge. This time, he built the walls thicker. Later that night, I stood by the front door again, hand resting lightly on the new keypad. The house felt steady. The air inside was warm. Diane had not won anything. Neither had I. But the terms had changed, and this time they were written in ink.
Chapter 6. Dessert Only. A year later, the house smelled like cinnamon and roasted turkey instead of tension. Thanksgiving 2023 was at our place in Brookfield. That decision alone felt like a quiet declaration. No long dining table dictated by someone else, no place cards arranged to send a message, just our kitchen, our rules, our door. Caleb had been up since 6, basting the turkey with the focus of an engineer measuring exact tolerances. Nolan, now 10, moved through the house with the kind of ease I hadn't realized I missed. He wore a Packers sweatshirt and had already claimed the job of setting out the dessert plates. Tom was coming at 1, Kelsey at 1:30, a couple of our friends from church around 2. Diane had been invited for dessert only. 3 to 4:30, 90 minutes. That had been Caleb's wording in the text message 2 weeks earlier. "You're welcome to join us for dessert from 3 to 4:30. No exclamation point, no apology." She responded with a simple acknowledgement. At 2:58, the doorbell camera notification appeared on my phone. Motion detected. I glanced at the screen. Diane stood on the porch in a dark green coat, holding a bakery box tied with twine. She looked exactly as she always did on holidays, composed, immaculate, intentional. But this time, she did not reach for the keypad. Her eyes flicked toward it. I watched that small, almost reflexive glance. A year ago, her fingers would have already been moving. Now, she stood still. She pressed the doorbell. Inside, the chime rang softly. Nolan looked up from the living room. "Is that Grandma?" "Yes." He didn't freeze, he didn't shrink, he didn't ask if he was in trouble. He just nodded and went back to arranging forks. I walked to the door and opened it. "Happy Thanksgiving," Diane said. "Happy Thanksgiving." She stepped inside when I moved aside, not ahead of me, not past me, just inside. Caleb came up behind me and rested his hand lightly at my back, not possessive, not defensive, present. Tom followed a few minutes later, the house filled with the low hum of conversation and the clink of plates. Diane stayed in the living room, perched on the edge of the sofa. She complimented the table setting. She asked Nolan about school. "How's 4th grade treating you?" "5th," he corrected gently. "It's good."
He spoke without looking to me for permission. She smiled, but it was smaller than it used to be. When dessert was served, Nolan carried the pie to the table himself. "Do you want a slice, Grandma?" "Yes, thank you." There was no adults-only announcement, no rearranging of seats, no subtle demotion. We all sat together. At one point, Diane's gaze drifted toward the hallway that led to the mudroom and the back door. I knew she was remembering the layout of our house, the way she used to walk through it without asking. Her eyes landed briefly on the keypad mounted beside the front door. She looked at it for a second longer than necessary. Then she looked away. The clock above the stove read 4:23 when she stood. I should be going. We walked her to the front door together. Caleb opened it. "Thank you for coming," he said evenly. "Thank you for having me." There was a beat of hesitation, then she bent slightly toward Nolan. "Goodbye." "Goodbye," he said, steady. No flinch, no retreat. Just goodbye. She stepped out onto the porch. The late November air was crisp, but not bitter. The sun was already dipping, casting long shadows across the lawn. Caleb waited until she reached her car before closing the door. The latch clicked into place. For a second, we all stood there in the entryway. "That was fine," Nolan said matter-of-factly. "Yes, it was," I replied. It wasn't triumphant, it wasn't dramatic, there were no slammed doors, no raised voices, no legal notices served. Diane had not lost her house, she had not lost her standing at church entirely, she had not been publicly humiliated beyond repair. What she had lost was access without permission. What she had lost was the assumption that her role outranked mine. Karma didn't look like collapse, it looked like compliance. Later that evening, after the dishes were rinsed and the leftovers packed away, Nolan carried his plate to the sink without being asked. He moved through the house as if it belonged to him. Because it did. Caleb wrapped an arm around my waist as we stood by the front window, watching the last of the guests' headlights disappear down the street. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded. I realized something then. Revenge isn't about making someone fall. It isn't about humiliation or spectacle, or proving a point so loudly that everyone hears it. It's about deciding who gets a key. It's about drawing a line and holding it, even when the person on the other side thinks they deserve to cross it. I walked to the front door and placed my hand lightly against the keypad. The small screen lit up in response, glowing green for a second before fading again. Inside, it was warm, steady. Nolan's laughter floated from the living room as he argued with Caleb about which movie to watch. I looked at that door, at the simple mechanism that now answered only to the codes we chose to program. And I thought about how different everything feels when you stop trying to keep the peace at the expense of your child. Where would you draw the line if it were your child? The lock clicked softly as I pressed it into place for the night, and the green light blinked once before fading into the dark.